What if I told you there's a book older than most of the Bible that was so dangerous? The church spent 1,000 years trying to destroy every copy. What if I told you this book reveals the true story of fallen angels breeding with humans, creating giants that once ruled the earth? Tonight, you're about to discover the forbidden truth they never wanted you to know. This isn't just another Bible story. This is the classified file of biblical history, the story that was deemed too dangerous for ordinary believers. We're talking about Enoch, son of the world's first murderer, who received visions so explosive that when he wrote them down, church leaders ordered every copy burned. His book revealed secrets about angelic warfare, supernatural giants, and divine judgment that were quoted in the New Testament and treasured by early Christians for centuries. But then the church made a decision. This book was too dangerous, too revealing, so they banned it and rewrote history to make it seem like it never existed. Except they failed. Hidden in remote Ethiopian mountains, one church refused to obey. They preserved this forbidden book for over 1,000 years, until a Scottish explorer discovered their secret in 1773. Tonight, we're breaking the silence. We're revealing why church leaders were so terrified of one ancient book that they tried to erase it from existence. You're about to discover the story of fallen angels, supernatural giants, and banned revelations. Once you know this truth, you'll never read your Bible the same way again. Are you ready? The story begins with blood on the ground and a man running from God. Chapter 1. The Mark of Blood. The story begins with blood soaking into the ground. Fresh blood from an innocent man, crying out for justice from the very soil of the earth. This wasn't just any murder. This was the moment that changed everything. The moment when Cain, consumed by jealousy and rage, raised his hand against his own brother Abel and took his life. Picture the scene. Two brothers standing in a field. Abel, the gentle shepherd, had just offered his sacrifice to God. The smoke from his offering rose straight up to heaven, a sweet aroma that pleased the Creator. But Cain's offering, it lay there on the ground, rejected, ignored, worthless. The humiliation burned inside Cain like a poison. Why does God love you more than me? Cain might have asked his brother, but Abel, innocent Abel, probably didn't even understand the question. He had simply given his best to God, not to show off, but out of love. That pure heart, that simple faith, it made Cain's jealousy burn even hotter. What happened next changed the world forever. In a moment of blind rage, Cain struck down his brother. The Bible tells us simply, Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. But imagine the horror of that moment. The first human blood ever spilled by another human hand. The earth itself had never witnessed such violence between family members. Here's what makes this even more chilling. Do you think Cain planned it? Or was it a moment of uncontrolled fury that shocked even him? Think about it. He's standing there, looking at his brother's lifeless body, probably shaking, probably terrified at what he's just done. The ground beneath his feet is dark with blood. His hands are stained red. And for the first time in human history, someone has to deal with the reality of death caused by violence. But God sees everything. When the Lord came looking for Abel, Cain tried to play innocent. "Where is your brother?" God asked. And Cain's response reveals the hardness that had already taken root in his heart. "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Can you hear the defiance in those words? Even after committing murder, Cain refuses to take responsibility. He's challenging God himself, acting like Abel's disappearance has nothing to do with him. But God's next words must have sent chills down Cain's spine. "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." The very earth was testifying against Cain. The soil that had received Abel's blood was speaking to God, demanding justice for this terrible crime. There was no hiding from divine justice, no way to cover up what had been done. The evidence was literally crying out from the ground. God's judgment was swift and perfectly fitting. "Now you are cursed from the earth," God declared. "When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." The man who had killed his brother on farmland would never again be able to make anything grow. The earth itself would reject his efforts. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. When Cain realized the full weight of his punishment, he broke down. "My punishment is more than I can bear," he cried. "You are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." For the first time since the murder, Cain was showing real emotion. He was terrified. He knew that in a world where justice was personal and swift, someone would want revenge for Abel's death. And in those days, justice often came at the point of a sword. But here's what's amazing about God's character. Even in judgment, there's mercy. God put a mark on Cain, not to shame him, but to protect him. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over, God declared. This mark was like a divine warning sign that said, "Don't touch this man, or you'll face God's wrath." What did this mark look like? The Bible doesn't tell us exactly. Some think it was a scar. Others believe it changed his appearance in some visible way. But whatever it was, everyone who saw it knew that this man was under God's protection. Think about that. Even after committing the world's first murder, God still showed mercy. With this mark of protection, Cain began his journey into exile. He left behind everything he had known, his family, his land, his old life. He was walking away from the presence of God, carrying the weight of his brother's blood and the mark of divine protection. The Bible tells us he went to the land of Nod, which means wandering. Can you imagine that journey? Every step taking him further from home, further from everything familiar. The mark on his body protected him from human revenge, but nothing could protect him from the loneliness, the regret, and the knowledge of what he had done. But Cain's story doesn't end in lonely wandering, because in the land of Nod, something remarkable happened. Cain found a wife among the other children of Adam and Eve, because by this time there were many other people on earth. and together they had a son who would change everything. They named him Enoch, which means dedicated or initiated. Perhaps Cain chose this name because he wanted to dedicate his son to a new beginning. Or maybe he sensed that this child would be initiated into something greater than either of them could imagine. This tiny baby represented hope, possibility, and the chance for redemption. But Cain didn't stop with just having a son. He did something that directly challenged God's judgment. God had said he would be a wanderer, never able to settle down. But Cain decided to stop wandering. He built the world's first city, and he named it after his son, Enoch. Think about what this means. Cain, the condemned wanderer, was saying, "I may not be able to make crops grow, but I can build something that will last. I can create a place where my son can have a better life than I've had." It was an act of defiance, but also an act of love. Building the world's first city was no small task. Cain had to find the right location, convince others to join him, and organize the massive construction project. This wasn't just a few houses thrown together. This was walls, gates, streets, and buildings. Cain was creating civilization itself. And young Enoch grew up in this remarkable place. Imagine being the first child to grow up in a city while other children were learning to tend sheep in open fields. Enoch was learning about walls and gates, about living close to other people, about complex social relationships. He was experiencing something no human child had ever experienced before. The city that bore his name became his playground, his school, and his inheritance. Every day, he was reminded that this entire place existed because of his father's vision and determination. But it wasn't just the physical city that shaped Enoch. It was the people who came to live there. Outcasts, innovators, creators, all looking for something new. As we'll discover, this unusual upbringing was preparing Enoch for a destiny that no one could have imagined. The son of a murderer, raised in the world's first city, was about to become the most spiritually enlightened human who had ever lived. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we can understand Enoch's incredible spiritual journey, we need to see how his father's city became a center of innovation and culture. Because what happened in that city would set the stage for everything that followed. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, make sure you're subscribed because we're just getting started. Hit that subscribe button now because what comes next will blow your mind. Chapter 2: City of the Cursed. Young Enoch grew up surrounded by the sounds of hammers on metal, music filling the air, and the constant bustle of people creating something completely new in human history. His father Cain had built more than just a city. He had created the world's first center of innovation and culture. The city of Enoch became a magnet for people who didn't fit in anywhere else. Think about it. If you were an outcast, an innovator, or someone looking for a fresh start, where would you go? You'd go to the one place where the ruler himself was an outcast, where new ideas were welcome, where the past didn't matter as much as what you could contribute to the future. This attracted some remarkable people to Enoch's city. The Bible tells us about Enoch's relatives and what they accomplished, and their achievements were revolutionary. Jabal became the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. But he wasn't just continuing old traditions. He was developing new ways to manage herds and flocks, even within a city environment. His brother Jubal was creating something the world had never heard before: music. He invented the harp and the flute, instruments that could make sounds that had never existed in creation. Imagine young Enoch hearing the first melodies ever played by human hands, seeing how music could stir emotions and bring people together in ways that nothing else could. Then there was Tubal-Cain, who worked with bronze and iron, forging tools and weapons that were stronger and more durable than anything made from stone or wood. The sound of his hammer rang through the streets as he and his apprentices worked, creating implements that would revolutionize how people lived and worked. But here's what's really fascinating. These weren't just random innovations happening by chance. These were all connected to Cain's family line. Music, metalwork, advanced animal husbandry, urban planning, all of these arts and sciences were being developed by Enoch's relatives. His city was becoming a hub of human creativity and innovation. Think about what this meant for young Enoch's education. While other children in the world were learning basic survival skills, Enoch was growing up surrounded by the world's first musicians, the first metal workers, the first city planners. He was learning about leadership by watching his father organize people and projects. He was learning about innovation by seeing his relatives invent entirely new ways of doing things. Every day brought new sounds, new sights, new possibilities. The lowing of cattle and bleating of sheep could be heard as Jabal's improved herding methods were put into practice. Beautiful music filled the air as Jubal taught others to play his instruments. The ring of hammers on metal echoed through the streets as Tubal-Cain's metalworking techniques spread to other craftsmen. This wasn't just a place to live. It was a place where human culture was being born. And Enoch was right at the center of it all, absorbing lessons about creativity, leadership, and the power of human determination. But there was something else happening in the world during this time, something that would create a growing tension in Enoch's life. While Cain's line was building cities and advancing technology, another family line was developing very differently. Adam and Eve had another son after Abel's death. They named him Seth, which means appointed, because they saw him as God's replacement for the son they had lost. And Seth's family line was taking a completely different path from Cain's descendants. The Bible tells us that in Seth's time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. This means Seth's descendants were developing organized worship, regular gatherings where people would pray together, sing together, and seek God's guidance together. They were maintaining and strengthening their relationship with their Creator. While Enoch's city buzzed with the sounds of innovation and progress, Seth's descendants gathered in quiet circles to pray and worship. While Cain's people were proud of their technological advances and cultural achievements, Seth's people were humble before God, seeking His will and guidance in everything they did. This created a growing divide in the human family. On one side, you had Cain's line, urban, innovative, culturally advanced, but moving further from God. They were focused on what humans could accomplish, on building and creating and advancing. On the other side, you had Seth's line, more traditional, focused on worship and relationship with God, living simpler lives, but maintaining their spiritual connection. The contrast was stark and troubling. Cain's descendants were building impressive cities with walls and gates, creating beautiful music and working with metals, but they rarely spoke of God or sought his guidance. Seth's descendants lived in simple tents and moved with their animals, but they regularly gathered to worship and pray, keeping their connection with their Creator strong. Stories would occasionally travel between the two communities. People from Seth's line would hear about the amazing city that Cain had built, with its impressive walls and innovative technologies. People from Cain's line would hear about Seth's descendants and their devotion to God, their simple way of life, their regular worship gatherings. But these stories often created more division than understanding. Cain's people saw Seth's line as backward and primitive, too focused on religion and not interested enough in progress. Seth's people saw Cain's line as prideful and godless, too focused on human achievement and not concerned enough with divine relationship. Young Enoch found himself right in the middle of this divide. He was heir to the world's most advanced civilization, surrounded by incredible human achievements, but he was also part of a family line that had been marked by violence and separation from God. As he grew older and began to take on more leadership responsibilities, these questions troubled him deeply. He could see that his people were accomplishing amazing things, but he could also sense that something was missing. There was an emptiness in their lives, a spiritual void that all their technology and culture couldn't fill. The city that bore his name was proof that humans could create something magnificent. But when he heard stories about Seth's line and their relationship with God, he wondered what his family had lost in their pursuit of progress and civilization. Had they gained the whole world but lost their souls? These weren't just philosophical questions for Enoch. As he prepared to take over leadership of the city, he had to make real decisions about its future direction. Would he continue his father's path of focusing purely on human achievement? Or was there another way, a path that could combine human innovation with spiritual connection? The stage was being set for something remarkable to happen in Enoch's life. He had been born into privilege and power, raised in the world's most advanced civilization, and groomed to lead his people into the future. But he was also carrying the weight of his family's history and the growing tension between human achievement and divine relationship. What happened next would not only change Enoch's life, but would create writings so controversial that the church would later try to destroy every copy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Don't go anywhere, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient history. Make sure you hit that like button if you're enjoying this journey into forbidden history. Chapter 3: The Divine Awakening. As Enoch took on more leadership responsibilities in his city, something unusual began happening to him. Despite being part of Cain's cursed lineage, despite coming from a family marked by violence and separation from God, Enoch found himself drawn to something his relatives had largely forgotten: a relationship with the Creator. It started simply enough. While his father Cain and the other city leaders focused on expanding walls and improving technologies, Enoch found himself asking different questions. He would stand on the city walls in the early morning hours, looking out over the land of Nod, and wonder about the God his grandfather Adam had once walked with in the garden. He had heard fragments of the old stories about a time when humans and God had spoken face to face, when the Creator would walk in the cool of the evening with the first humans. The contrast between his family's current life and those ancient stories troubled him deeply. Here's what's remarkable. Cain's descendants had achieved so much. They had music that could stir the soul, metalwork that created tools stronger than stone, impressive architecture that provided security and organization. But they had also lost something precious in the process. They had lost their connection to the divine. They had become so focused on what they could build with their own hands that they had forgotten who had given them those hands in the first place. So focused on human achievement that they had forgotten their Creator. So proud of their accomplishments that they had stopped seeking divine guidance. For Enoch, this realization was both troubling and transformative. As the heir to this great civilization, he could have simply continued the path his father had set. He could have focused on making the city bigger, the walls stronger, the innovations more impressive. But something deep inside him was calling for something more. The first breakthrough came during a particularly difficult time in the city's leadership. A serious dispute had arisen between different groups of craftsmen, and traditional methods of solving the problem weren't working. Tempers were rising, productivity was falling, and Enoch could see that his city was in danger of tearing itself apart. As he wrestled with how to bring peace to his people, Enoch found himself doing something his family hadn't done in generations. He prayed, not to idols or to human achievement, but to the God of his ancestors, the God who had walked with Adam, the God who had shown mercy even to his murderous great-grandfather Cain. What happened next changed everything. As Enoch prayed for wisdom to lead his people justly, he began to receive insights that seemed to come from beyond his own understanding. Solutions to complex problems would become clear to him. He would know how to speak to angry people in ways that calmed their hearts. He developed a wisdom in leadership that amazed even the older residents of the city. People began to notice the change in Enoch. His decisions as a leader became more fair and wise. He seemed to understand people's needs in ways that went beyond normal human perception. When conflicts arose, he could find solutions that satisfied everyone involved. When people brought him their problems, he always seemed to know exactly what to say to help them. But the most remarkable thing was what began happening during his times of prayer and meditation. Enoch started experiencing what could only be called prophetic visions. These weren't dreams or imagination. They were vivid, clear revelations that showed him things far beyond the walls of his city. The first vision came as Enoch was praying for guidance about his city's future. Suddenly, his awareness expanded beyond the physical walls around him. He found himself seeing the world from a perspective that was impossible for normal human sight. He could see the spiritual realm that existed alongside the physical world he knew. It was like having his eyes open to a completely different dimension of reality. The physical world was still there, the stones of the city walls, the streets below, the buildings and people. But now he could also see the spiritual layer that existed alongside everything physical. He saw angels moving among the people, influencing their thoughts and decisions. He saw the prayers of righteous people rising like incense toward heaven. Think about how overwhelming this must have been for Enoch. One moment, he's a city leader dealing with practical problems, and the next moment, he's seeing into the very throne room of God. One moment, he's focused on walls and gates and trade agreements, and the next, he's witnessing the cosmic order that governs all creation. But God prepared Enoch gradually for these revelations. The visions started small and grew more intense over time. The first encounters were with beings of incredible beauty and power, angels who served the Most High God. These weren't terrifying, otherworldly creatures that would frighten humans. Instead, they appeared to Enoch as messengers of peace and wisdom, beings who had been sent to guide and teach him. The first angel who spoke to Enoch introduced himself as a messenger sent by the Most High. He explained that Enoch had been chosen for a special purpose, though the full scope of that purpose would be revealed gradually. This angel, whose name was Uriel, became Enoch's primary guide and teacher in the early stages of his spiritual journey. Uriel taught Enoch about the nature of prayer and how to discern between his own thoughts and divine revelations. He showed Enoch how to quiet his mind and heart so that he could hear the voice of God more clearly. These early lessons were crucial because they prepared Enoch for the much more intense revelations that were to come. But as Enoch's spiritual sensitivity grew, so did the scope of his visions. The angels began taking him on journeys that defied all natural understanding. His physical body would remain in his chamber or on the city walls, but his spirit would travel to places that no human had ever seen. The first of these spirit journeys was both thrilling and terrifying. Enoch found himself lifted up from his physical location and carried through the air at incredible speed. Below him, the earth spread out like a map, showing him lands and peoples he had never known existed. He could see great rivers that watered the earth, mountain ranges that divided different regions, and vast oceans that surrounded the continents. But these travels through the heavenly realms were unlike anything that could be described in ordinary language. Enoch found himself moving through dimensions of reality that existed beyond the physical world. He saw the throne room of the Most High, witnessed the worship of countless angels, and observed the cosmic order that governed all creation. In one particularly vivid journey, Enoch was taken to what seemed like the very edge of creation itself. He saw the foundations of the earth, the pillars that held up the sky, and the storehouses where God kept the snow and hail. He witnessed the paths of the sun and moon, understanding for the first time the incredible precision with which the Creator had designed the universe. The angel Uriel explained to him how God had established laws that governed not just human behavior, but the behavior of all creation. The sun knew its appointed time to rise and set. The moon followed its phases with perfect regularity. The stars moved in their courses according to divine command. The seasons changed in their proper order, and the rain fell when it was needed. Here's what this meant for Enoch. He was seeing that the same God who had created this incredible cosmic order was the same God who wanted relationship with humans. The same divine power that kept the stars in their courses was the same power that had shown mercy to his murderous ancestor Cain. This realization was both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it showed Enoch how small human achievements were compared to divine power, but empowering because it revealed that this all-powerful God actually cared about human beings and wanted to communicate with them. As these revelations continued, Enoch began to understand that his unique position, coming from Cain's line but seeking God's face, gave him a special role to play in divine plans. He was about to become a bridge between the earthly and heavenly realms, a mediator between angels and mankind. But before we explore that incredible calling, we need to understand what Enoch was shown about the spiritual realm, because what he witnessed would later be recorded in writings so controversial that the church would ban them for over 1,000 years. Keep watching, because we're about to uncover the forbidden secrets that changed everything. And if this story is opening your eyes to hidden biblical mysteries, share it with someone who needs to hear this truth. Chapter 4: Watchers in the Shadows. During his heavenly journeys, Enoch was shown something that would shake him to his core. He discovered that there were spiritual beings called Watchers who had been given important responsibilities on earth, but some of them had gone terribly wrong. What Enoch witnessed about these beings would later become the most controversial part of his writings. The Watchers were a special group of angels who had been assigned to watch over humanity and guide their development. Originally, they had been faithful in their duties. They had taught humans useful skills like agriculture, animal husbandry, and basic crafts. They had guided human civilization in ways that honored God and promoted human flourishing. Think about this. These weren't just any angels. These were beings specifically chosen by God to help humanity grow and develop while staying connected to their Creator. They were supposed to be mentors, guides, bridges between the heavenly and earthly realms. They had knowledge about the workings of creation, about the movements of the stars, about the properties of plants and metals, about the arts of healing and building. But in his visions, Enoch was shown how some of these watchers had begun to desire things they were not meant to have. They had looked upon human women and found them beautiful. They had begun to crave physical experiences that were forbidden to their kind. They had started to want what they were supposed to be protecting. The book of Genesis hints at this when it says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. But Enoch's visions revealed the full scope of what was happening behind these brief biblical words. These fallen watchers were not just taking human wives, they were sharing forbidden knowledge with humanity, knowledge that wasn't evil in itself, but was being given at the wrong time and in the wrong way. They were giving humanity advanced information without the wisdom to use it properly. Enoch saw how this rebellion began with just a few watchers who decided to break their divine commands. Led by one called Samjhenge, they made a pact among themselves to descend to earth and take human wives. They convinced each other that if they all participated in this rebellion, none of them could be singled out for punishment. 200 watchers joined this rebellion. Each one chose a human woman and took her as a wife. But their sin didn't stop with these forbidden marriages. They began competing with each other to see who could share the most impressive knowledge with their human families and communities. Here's where it gets really disturbing. Azazel taught humans how to make swords, knives, shields, and armor. He showed them how to work with metals to create weapons of war that were far more deadly than anything humans had possessed before. Think about this. Warfare up to this point had been relatively simple, using basic tools and weapons. But now, humans were learning to create instruments of mass destruction. Barakel taught humans about astrology and how to read the movements of the stars for selfish purposes. Kokabel taught them about making signs and omens. Ezekiel taught them about cloud reading and weather prediction for personal gain. Each fallen watcher was sharing knowledge that should have been reserved for divine purposes only. But here's what makes this even more sinister. They weren't just sharing random information. They were deliberately corrupting human understanding of divine truth. They were taking knowledge that was meant to help humans appreciate God's creation and twisting it into tools for manipulation, violence, and self-worship. Enoch watched in his visions as this forbidden knowledge spread throughout the earth like a spiritual plague. He saw how it corrupted not just individuals, but entire communities. People began using their new knowledge for selfish and destructive purposes. They created weapons to hurt each other, used magic to manipulate and deceive, and became obsessed with physical beauty and material wealth. The knowledge of metalwork, which should have been used to create tools for farming and building, was instead used primarily for making weapons. The understanding of astronomy, which should have helped humans appreciate God's creation, was twisted into astrology and fortune-telling. The arts of cosmetics and jewelry, which could have been simple expressions of beauty, became sources of vanity and pride that divided people into social classes. But the most disturbing consequence of these forbidden unions was the offspring they produced, the Nephilim. These giants possessed both human and angelic nature, but they inherited the corrupted desires of their fathers rather than divine holiness. Enoch saw these beings growing to enormous size and strength, but also developing an insatiable appetite for violence and destruction. They weren't just physically large, they were also intellectually gifted, with knowledge from their angelic fathers. This made them incredibly dangerous because they combined superhuman strength with advanced knowledge about warfare, manipulation, and control. The Nephilim established themselves as rulers over human communities, demanding tribute and worship. They used their superior abilities to dominate and terrorize normal humans. They became tyrants who ruled through fear and violence, creating a reign of terror that spread across the earth. Think about how this must have felt to ordinary humans living during this time. Suddenly, there were these massive beings with supernatural knowledge and strength ruling over them. Beings who could crush them physically and outsmart them intellectually. Beings who had no compassion, no sense of justice, only an endless hunger for power and pleasure. In vision after vision, Enoch was shown how this corruption was spreading across the earth like a disease. Even the descendants of Seth, who had tried to maintain their relationship with God, were being influenced by the forbidden knowledge and intimidated by the Nephilim. The simple, faithful communities that had once called on the name of the Lord were being corrupted or destroyed. Enoch witnessed scenes of violence and wickedness that broke his heart. He saw the earth being filled with bloodshed as humans used their new weapons against each other. He watched as the knowledge of sorcery led people away from truth and into deception. He observed how the focus on physical beauty and material wealth was destroying the simple relationships that had once brought humans joy. But perhaps most tragic of all, he saw how the spiritual connection between humans and God was being severed. The forbidden knowledge wasn't just changing how people lived, it was changing how they thought about their Creator. They were beginning to worship the Watchers who had taught them these things, seeing them as gods worthy of reverence and sacrifice. This spiritual adultery was breaking God's heart. The humans he had created for fellowship and relationship were turning away from him to worship fallen angels. They were exchanging the truth of God for lies, trading eternal spiritual reality for temporary physical pleasure and power. As Enoch continued to witness these visions, he began to understand the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about a few rebellious angels taking human wives. This was a coordinated attack on God's creation, an attempt to corrupt humanity so completely that they would be cut off from their Creator forever. The fallen Watchers weren't just satisfying their own desires. They were waging war against God himself by trying to destroy his most precious creation. They were attempting to make humanity so wicked and corrupted that God would have no choice but to destroy them completely. But God had other plans, and Enoch was about to be shown the most terrifying vision of all, the coming judgment that would cleanse the earth of this corruption. A judgment so complete and so devastating that it would wash away the Nephilim, remove the influence of the fallen Watchers, and give humanity a fresh start. What Enoch saw next would become one of the most controversial prophecies ever recorded. A prophecy that would later be quoted in the New Testament itself, but would also become one of the main reasons why church leaders would try to destroy his writings. Stay with me, because we're about to uncover the forbidden prophecy that terrified religious authorities for centuries. Hit that like button if you're ready to discover why the church was so afraid of Enoch's revelations. Chapter 5: The Forbidden Teaching. What Enoch witnessed next in his visions would become some of the most controversial content ever recorded in religious literature. He was shown in vivid detail exactly what knowledge the fallen watchers were teaching humanity, and why this knowledge was so dangerous that it would ultimately lead to divine judgment. The angel Uriel explained to Enoch that knowledge itself wasn't evil. It was the timing and manner of its revelation that made it forbidden. God had planned to gradually reveal certain truths to humanity as they developed spiritually and morally. But the fallen watchers were giving advanced knowledge to people who weren't ready for it, like giving weapons to children. Azazel's teachings about metalworking were perhaps the most immediately destructive. In Enoch's visions, he saw humans who had lived peaceful lives suddenly learning to forge swords, spears, and shields. The angel showed him workshops where men worked day and night, not to create tools for farming or building, but to create instruments of war. But here's what made this so tragic. These weren't naturally violent people who were seeking better ways to hurt each other. These were ordinary humans who were being taught that violence was the solution to their problems. They were learning that the strong should dominate the weak, that conflicts should be resolved through bloodshed rather than discussion. The knowledge of weapon making spread like wildfire because it gave immediate power to those who possessed it. Communities that learned metalworking could dominate their neighbors. Individuals who mastered these techniques could become rulers through force. It created an arms race that escalated violence across the entire earth. But the corruption went far deeper than just physical weapons. Barakel's teaching about astrology was corrupting human understanding of their relationship with God. Instead of seeing the stars as signs of God's glory and markers of His appointed times, people were learning to use them for fortune-telling and manipulation. Enoch was shown visions of people consulting the stars to make decisions instead of praying to God for guidance. He saw communities being divided by astrological beliefs, with people treating their neighbors differently based on when they were born or what celestial signs were present at various times. This wasn't just superstition, it was spiritual adultery. People were looking to creation instead of the Creator for guidance about their lives. They were treating the stars, which God had made as lights and signs, as if they were gods themselves with power over human destiny. Kokabel's teaching about signs and omens was equally corrupting. Humans were learning to create false miracles and deceptive wonders that would make people think they had divine power. They were discovering how to manipulate natural phenomena to make themselves appear supernatural. In his visions, Enoch saw charlatans using these techniques to deceive entire communities, setting themselves up as prophets and priests while leading people away from true worship of God. They were creating counterfeit spiritual experiences that felt real but were actually demonic deceptions. Ezekiel's knowledge about weather patterns and cloud reading was being used for selfish gain rather than community benefit. Instead of helping farmers know when to plant and harvest for everyone's good, this knowledge was being hoarded by individuals who used it to manipulate trade and accumulate wealth. But perhaps the most insidious corruption was in the area of beauty and vanity. The fallen watchers taught human women about cosmetics, jewelry, and elaborate clothing that went far beyond simple adornment. They were teaching them to use their appearance as a weapon of manipulation and a source of pride and division. Enoch saw how this knowledge created competition and jealousy among women who had previously lived in harmony. Communities became divided between those who could afford elaborate beauty treatments and those who could not. Simple relationships were destroyed by vanity and pride. More disturbing still, these beauty techniques were connected to spiritual corruption. The cosmetics and jewelry weren't just about looking attractive. They were tied to occult practices and false worship. Women were being taught to use their enhanced beauty in religious ceremonies dedicated to fallen angels rather than to God. The fallen watchers were also teaching advanced mathematics and writing systems, but even these seemingly beneficial skills were being corrupted. The mathematical knowledge was being used primarily for astrological calculations and occult practices, rather than for practical problem solving. The writing systems were being used to record spells and incantations, rather than to preserve God's truth. What made all of this so heartbreaking was that Enoch could see how each piece of forbidden knowledge built upon the others to create a comprehensive system of corruption. The weapons created through advanced metalworking were being used to enforce the social divisions created by beauty culture. The astrological knowledge was being used to justify the violence and oppression. The false signs and omens were being used to maintain the power structures built through force. It was like watching a beautiful tapestry being systematically unraveled and rewoven into something ugly and destructive. Every thread of knowledge that should have been used to glorify God and benefit humanity was being twisted into a tool of corruption and separation from the Creator. But here's what really shocked Enoch in these visions. The fallen watchers weren't just teaching these things randomly. They had a deliberate plan to corrupt humanity so completely that God would have no choice but to destroy His creation. They were trying to win their rebellion against God by making humans so wicked that divine judgment would be inevitable. The angel Uriel explained to Enoch that this was spiritual warfare at its most fundamental level. The fallen watchers weren't just satisfying their own desires. They were attempting to prove that God's creation was a failure, that humans couldn't be trusted with free will, that the entire project of creating beings capable of fellowship with their Creator was doomed from the start. In vision after vision, Enoch saw how this corruption was accelerating. Each generation was becoming more violent, more deceptive, more focused on temporary pleasures and power rather than eternal truth and relationship with God. The knowledge that should have led to human flourishing was instead leading to human destruction. Children were growing up in a world where violence was normal, where manipulation was expected, where spiritual truth was mixed with demonic deception. They were learning from their parents how to use the forbidden knowledge for selfish gain rather than how to live in harmony with God and each other. The most tragic part of these visions was seeing how the remnant of faithful people, those who still tried to follow God, were being overwhelmed by the corruption around them. Even in communities that tried to maintain righteousness, the influence of the forbidden knowledge was seeping in, corrupting their worship and dividing their families. Enoch saw righteous men struggling to protect their families from the violence that was becoming commonplace. He witnessed faithful women trying to raise their children with proper values while being surrounded by a culture that celebrated vanity and manipulation. He observed entire communities that had once worshipped God together being torn apart by the social divisions created by the forbidden knowledge. But perhaps most disturbing of all, he saw how the corruption was affecting people's very ability to hear God's voice. The forbidden knowledge wasn't just changing how people behaved, it was changing how they thought. It was creating a spiritual deafness that made it increasingly difficult for humans to recognize divine truth when they encountered it. People were becoming so accustomed to the lies and deceptions that truth itself seemed foreign to them. They were so focused on temporary, physical concerns that eternal, spiritual realities seemed irrelevant. They were so caught up in the pursuit of power and pleasure that the idea of serving and worshipping their Creator seemed foolish. This spiritual blindness was perhaps the most successful aspect of the fallen Watchers' plan. They weren't just corrupting human behavior, they were corrupting human perception. They were making it increasingly difficult for people to even want relationship with God, let alone know how to pursue it. As these visions continued, Enoch began to understand that something drastic would have to happen to break this cycle of corruption. The forbidden knowledge had created a spiritual cancer that was spreading throughout humanity, and only divine intervention could stop it from destroying God's creation completely. What he was about to see next would be both terrifying and hopeful, a judgment so complete that it would wash away the corruption, but also a plan for redemption that would preserve the possibility of renewed relationship between God and humanity. Don't miss what comes next, because Enoch's vision of divine judgment contains prophecies that are still relevant today. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you won't miss any part of this incredible story. Chapter 6: Giants Among Men. The offspring of the forbidden unions between fallen Watchers and human women were unlike anything the world had ever seen. In his visions, Enoch was shown these beings in terrifying detail: the Nephilim, giants who possessed both human and angelic nature, but who had inherited only the worst characteristics of both. These weren't just large humans. The Nephilim were massive beings who towered over ordinary people like adults tower over small children. Some reached heights of 15 feet or more, with proportional strength that made them living weapons. But their size was only the beginning of what made them so dangerous. Because their fathers were angels, the Nephilim possessed supernatural knowledge and abilities that no human could match. They understood the workings of the spiritual realm in ways that gave them power over ordinary humans. They could manipulate spiritual forces, create deceptive wonders, and influence people's minds in ways that seemed magical. But here's what made them truly monstrous. They had inherited their fallen father's rebellion against God, combined with human flesh that craved physical pleasure and satisfaction. This created beings with supernatural power but no moral restraint, creatures who could do almost anything they wanted and had no conscience to stop them. In vision after vision, Enoch watched these giants establishing themselves as rulers over human communities. They didn't need to persuade or convince people to follow them. They simply dominated through superior strength and supernatural knowledge. They became the world's first tyrants, ruling through fear and intimidation. The Nephilim demanded not just obedience, but worship. They set themselves up as gods, requiring sacrifices and tributes from the humans under their control. Communities that had once worshipped the true God were forced to bow down to these corrupted beings, offering them the reverence that belonged only to their Creator. But their oppression went far beyond just demanding worship. The giants had inherited their father's knowledge about warfare, and they used this knowledge to establish brutal military systems. They organized armies of humans armed with the advanced weapons their fathers had taught them to make, and they used these forces to conquer and dominate neighboring regions. Enoch saw battles unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. These weren't just conflicts between human tribes using basic weapons. These were wars directed by beings with supernatural military knowledge, using advanced metallurgy and strategic understanding that made them nearly impossible to defeat. The giants established kingdoms built on violence and oppression. They created social systems where the strong dominated the weak without mercy, where justice was determined by power rather than righteousness, where the ordinary humans they ruled were treated more like livestock than like people created in God's image. But perhaps most disturbing of all, the Nephilim were never satisfied. Their supernatural nature gave them appetites that couldn't be filled through normal means. They consumed enormous amounts of food, demanding tribute from multiple communities just to sustain themselves. When the regular food supply wasn't enough, some of them began consuming human flesh. Think about how horrifying this must have been for ordinary people living during this time. These massive beings with supernatural knowledge and insatiable appetites were ruling over them, demanding everything they produced, and sometimes even consuming their neighbors and family members. It was like living in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The giants also inherited their father's corrupted sexuality. They took multiple human wives and concubines, treating women as property to be collected and used for their pleasure. They showed no respect for family bonds or community relationships, taking whatever they wanted whenever they wanted it. This sexual corruption spread throughout the communities under their control. The giants' example influenced human behavior, creating cultures where sexual violence and exploitation became normalized. Marriage and family relationships, which were meant to reflect God's love and faithfulness, were corrupted into systems of ownership and abuse. The Nephilim also used their supernatural knowledge to create false religious systems that mixed truth with deception. They established worship practices that included real spiritual power, because they had access to angelic knowledge, but directed that power toward evil purposes rather than toward God. People living under giant rule found themselves trapped in religious systems that seemed to work. Prayers were answered, supernatural events occurred, needs were sometimes met. But the source of the power was demonic rather than divine. It became increasingly difficult for humans to distinguish between true spiritual power that came from God and false spiritual power that came from fallen angels. These corrupted religious systems also involved human sacrifice. The giants demanded not just tribute and worship, but actual human lives offered to them as sacrifices. Communities were forced to give up their children and loved ones to satisfy the appetites of these monstrous rulers. Enoch saw how this created cultures of fear and despair, where parents lived in constant terror that their children might be chosen for sacrifice, where communities were torn apart by the need to decide who would be given to the giants, where hope itself seemed to die under the weight of constant oppression. But the corruption didn't stop with individual giant rulers. The Nephilim began interbreeding with each other and with humans, creating a complex hierarchy of hybrid beings with varying levels of supernatural power and corruption. Some were more human-like, but still possessed unnatural strength and knowledge. Others were more angelic in their abilities, but retained human appetites and desires. This created a ruling class of supernatural beings who controlled every aspect of human society. At the top were the original Nephilim, children of fallen watchers and human women. Below them were their offspring and other hybrid beings with lesser but still significant supernatural abilities. At the bottom were ordinary humans who were treated as servants, slaves, and food sources. The political systems that developed under giant rule were unlike anything that had existed before. These weren't kingdoms based on human leadership, inheritance, or even conquest in the normal sense. These were supernatural tyrannies where the rulers possessed abilities that made resistance seem impossible. Human communities lost all sense of self-governance or justice. Decisions were made based on the whims and appetites of giant rulers who had no understanding of human needs or divine moral standards. Laws, when they existed at all, served only to protect the interests of the supernatural ruling class. Trade and economic systems were also corrupted under giant rule. The advanced knowledge that the fallen watchers had shared was used to create monopolies and systems of exploitation. The giants controlled the production of advanced weapons and tools, ensuring that humans remained dependent on them for protection and survival. But perhaps most tragic of all was how the presence of the giants affected human relationships with each other and with God. Living under supernatural oppression, humans began to lose hope that divine justice was possible. If God existed and cared about human suffering, why didn't he intervene to stop these monsters? Some humans began to wonder if the giants were actually the true gods, if the stories about a creator who loved humanity were just myths from a simpler time. Others maintained their faith, but struggled with despair, wondering why God seemed absent during their greatest time of need. The faithful remnant of humanity found themselves in an impossible situation. They were surrounded by supernatural enemies who outmatched them in every way: strength, knowledge, military power, and spiritual abilities. Traditional forms of resistance were useless against beings who possessed angelic knowledge and supernatural strength. Yet some humans continued to call upon the name of the Lord, continued to maintain their faith despite overwhelming evidence that they were powerless against their oppressors. These faithful people became special targets of giant persecution because their continued worship of the true God was a reminder that the giants were not the ultimate authority. As Enoch witnessed these visions of giant oppression, he began to understand why divine judgment was inevitable. This wasn't just about punishing the wicked, it was about rescuing the innocent and preserving the possibility of authentic human relationship with God. The corruption had become so complete, the oppression so overwhelming, that only direct divine intervention could break the cycle of violence and spiritual deception that the giants had created. The earth itself was crying out for justice, just as Abel's blood had once cried out after Cain's murder. But God's response to this crisis would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. What Enoch was about to witness would be both the most terrifying and the most hope-filled vision of his entire spiritual journey. Stay tuned, because we're about to discover the divine judgment that would reshape the entire world. And if you're shocked by these revelations about the giants, wait until you see what God planned to do about them. Chapter 7. Visions of Judgment. What Enoch witnessed next was the most terrifying vision he had ever experienced. As he watched the corruption spread across the earth, saw the giants oppressing humanity, and observed the complete breakdown of relationships between humans and their creator, suddenly his vision expanded to show him God's perspective on these events. For the first time in his spiritual journey, Enoch was allowed to see into the very throne room of the Most High. What he witnessed there would shake him to his core and provide the foundation for some of the most controversial prophecies ever recorded. He saw the Creator, the God who had made all things with love and hope, looking down at what his creation had become. The Bible tells us that God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. But Enoch was shown the emotional reality behind those words. He witnessed the grief of the Almighty as he looked upon the violence, corruption, and spiritual adultery that had consumed the earth. This wasn't the anger of a tyrant whose commands had been disobeyed. This was the heartbreak of a loving father watching his children destroy themselves and each other. The angel Uriel explained to Enoch that God's judgment wasn't motivated by rage or vindictiveness, but by love for what humanity could become if they were freed from the corruption that was destroying them. The giants and fallen watchers had created a system so thoroughly evil that it was impossible for humans to escape its influence through their own efforts. Every child born into this corrupted world was immediately exposed to violence, deception, and spiritual darkness. They were learning from birth that might makes right, that the strong should oppress the weak, that spiritual power comes from serving fallen angels rather than the true God. Without divine intervention, humanity would continue spiraling deeper into corruption until they completely forgot their divine purpose. But what Enoch saw next was almost too incredible to believe. God wasn't just planning to punish the wicked. He was planning to wash the entire earth clean and give humanity a fresh start. The judgment would be so complete and so thorough that it would remove not just the giants and their corruption, but the very environment that had made such corruption possible. Enoch was shown visions of water, vast amounts of water covering the entire earth. He saw the fountains of the great deep being broken up and the windows of heaven being opened. This wasn't just a local flood or even a regional disaster. This was a complete reshaping of the earth itself. In vision after vision, he watched as the rising waters covered first the valleys, then the hills, then even the highest mountains. Nothing on the earth's surface survived this deluge. The giants, with all their supernatural strength, were powerless against the cosmic forces that God unleashed. The advanced weapons and technologies that the fallen watchers had taught humanity were useless against a judgment that came from the Creator of all natural laws. But here's what made these visions both terrifying and hopeful. Enoch was also shown that God would preserve a remnant. One man and his family would be saved through divine guidance and protection. Noah, who had remained faithful despite living in the most corrupted generation in human history, would be given detailed instructions for building a vessel that could survive the flood. Enoch saw the careful planning that went into this preservation. God didn't just tell Noah to build any boat. He gave him specific dimensions, materials, and construction methods that would create a vessel capable of surviving a worldwide catastrophe. Every detail was designed to ensure that humanity would have a new beginning after the judgment was complete. The vision of the flood was overwhelming in its scope and power. Enoch watched as communities that had seemed invincible were swept away in minutes. Giants who had ruled through supernatural strength were helpless against the rising waters. Technologies that had taken generations to develop were destroyed completely, their knowledge lost forever. But perhaps most significant of all, the fallen watchers themselves faced judgment. Enoch was shown how these rebellious angels were bound and imprisoned. Their direct influence on human affairs ended forever. They would no longer be able to take human wives, teach forbidden knowledge, or corrupt humanity through direct intervention. The angel Uriel explained that this binding of the Watchers was crucial for humanity's future. As long as these powerful beings remained free to influence human development, there would always be the danger of corruption spreading faster than human wisdom could develop to resist it. The flood would not only remove the current corruption, but also prevent its immediate return. However, Enoch was also shown that the judgment would not eliminate evil entirely. The human heart itself had been corrupted by the fall in the Garden of Eden, and that corruption would survive the flood in Noah's family. Future generations would still face the temptation to choose self-will over divine guidance, but they would not face the overwhelming supernatural corruption that had made righteousness nearly impossible in the pre-flood world. The visions of judgment also revealed God's long-term plan for dealing with evil permanently. Enoch was shown glimpses of a future time when the Creator himself would come to earth in human form, would live among his people, and would ultimately defeat evil, not through destruction, but through sacrificial love. These prophetic visions extended far beyond the immediate judgment of the flood. Enoch saw kingdoms that would rise and fall, peoples who would come to know God, and events that would shape human history for thousands of years. He witnessed the eventual restoration when righteousness would reign on earth and when humans would once again enjoy the kind of direct fellowship with God that had existed in the Garden of Eden. But the most remarkable part of these judgment visions was when Enoch was shown his own role in these cosmic events. The angels revealed that he had been chosen not just to witness these things, but to record them for future generations. He was to become a divine scribe, writing down everything he had seen and heard during his heavenly journeys. This commission came with a specific purpose. Enoch's writings would provide guidance and hope for people living through future times of corruption and judgment. When humans in later generations faced spiritual darkness and wondered if God had abandoned them, they could read Enoch's accounts and understand that the Creator was still in control, still working to accomplish his purposes of redemption and restoration. The angel Uriel also revealed that Enoch's unique position, coming from Cain's cursed line but walking with God, made him the perfect mediator between heaven and earth. His writings would demonstrate that no one was beyond the reach of divine grace, that even the most corrupted lineages could produce individuals who found favor with God. As these visions of judgment continued, Enoch began to understand the cosmic scope of the spiritual battle he had been witnessing. This wasn't just about correcting human behavior or punishing individual sins. This was about the ultimate question of whether God's creation could fulfill its intended purpose. The fallen watchers had essentially argued that God's experiment with free-willed beings was a failure, that creatures given the choice between good and evil would inevitably choose evil, that the only way to maintain cosmic order was through force and deception rather than love and truth. The flood would serve as God's answer to this challenge. By preserving Noah's family, humans who had chosen to remain faithful despite overwhelming pressure to conform to corruption, God would demonstrate that authentic relationship between Creator and creation was still possible. But the visions also revealed that this would not be the final answer to the problem of evil. The ultimate resolution would come through the promised Redeemer, who would succeed where humanity had failed, who would remain perfectly faithful where humans had chosen rebellion, and who would open the way for renewed fellowship between God and his creation. These prophetic visions filled Enoch with both awe and responsibility. He had been given glimpses of cosmic truths that few humans would ever see, but with that privilege came the obligation to record these revelations accurately and preserve them for future generations. What happened next would transform Enoch from a visionary into an active participant in divine plans. He was about to receive a commission that would make him one of the most important figures in spiritual history, and would also create writings so controversial that religious authorities would try to destroy them completely. Keep watching, because we're about to discover how Enoch became heaven's chosen scribe and why his writings would later terrify the church. Hit that subscribe button now, because this story is about to reach its most incredible climax. Chapter 8: The Heavenly Scribe. After witnessing these overwhelming visions of judgment and redemption, Enoch expected his supernatural experiences to end. He had seen the throne room of God, witnessed the corruption of the watchers, observed the coming flood, and received glimpses of future divine plans. Surely, this was more than any human was meant to experience in one lifetime. But the angels had other plans for Enoch. During one of his most profound heavenly encounters, he was given a divine commission that would change not just his own destiny, but the course of human spiritual understanding for thousands of years to come. The angel Uriel, who had been Enoch's primary guide throughout his spiritual journey, approached him with a scroll and writing instruments unlike anything that existed on earth. These weren't made of ordinary materials. They seemed to be composed of light itself, yet solid enough to write upon. "You have been chosen," Uriel explained, "not just to witness these revelations, but to record them for future generations. You will become a scribe of the Most High, writing down the secrets of heaven and earth that have been revealed to you." This commission was overwhelming in its scope. Enoch was being asked to capture in human language experiences that transcended normal human understanding. How could earthly words describe the throne room of God? How could physical writing convey the reality of spiritual dimensions? How could finite language express infinite truths? But the angels provided supernatural assistance for this impossible task. They taught Enoch not just what to write, but how to write it. They showed him symbols and forms of expression that could convey spiritual truths in ways that ordinary language could not. They gave him understanding that went far beyond his natural education in the city that bore his name. As Enoch began his work as a divine scribe, something miraculous happened. The words would flow through him with supernatural inspiration. He would find himself writing about things he had never studied, describing places he had never seen with his physical eyes, explaining spiritual concepts that were beyond normal human comprehension. The writing process itself was unlike anything any human had ever experienced. As Enoch sat with his celestial writing materials, divine knowledge would flow through his mind and onto the scroll. He wasn't just recording his memories of visions, he was receiving continuous revelation as he wrote, with new insights and understanding being given to him in the very act of composition. The first sections he completed dealt with the rebellion of the Watchers and its consequences. He wrote detailed accounts of how these angelic beings had corrupted themselves and humanity, naming specific Watchers and describing exactly what forbidden knowledge each one had shared. This wasn't just general information. These were precise records that could serve as testimony in divine courts of justice. As he wrote about Azazel's teaching of weapon making, Barachel's corruption through astrology, and Kokabul's deceptive signs and omens, Enoch found himself understanding not just what had happened, but why it was so significant in the cosmic battle between good and evil. Each piece of forbidden knowledge represented an attempt to undermine humanity's relationship with their creator. The accounts of the Nephilim that flowed through Enoch's pen were both detailed and disturbing. He described their enormous size, their supernatural abilities, and their systematic oppression of ordinary humans. But he also revealed the spiritual significance of their existence. They represented the ultimate corruption of God's image in humanity, beings who possessed divine knowledge and power, but used it for purely selfish and destructive purposes. But perhaps the most challenging part of his writing assignment was recording the visions of divine judgment. How do you describe the grief of the Almighty? How do you convey the cosmic scope of the coming flood? How do you explain divine justice in ways that humans can understand without minimizing either God's love or his righteousness? The angels guided Enoch through these difficulties, helping him find language that could communicate divine truth without overwhelming human readers. They showed him how to balance the terrifying aspects of divine judgment with the hopeful elements of divine redemption, how to make cosmic truths relevant to individual human experience. As his writing progressed, Enoch discovered that his role extended beyond just recording past visions. He began receiving new revelations specifically for the purpose of including them in his written work. The angels would show him additional details about the spiritual realm, provide answers to questions that hadn't occurred to him during his earlier experiences, and give him prophetic insights about events that were still far in the future. One of the most remarkable aspects of this expanded revelation was when Enoch was shown the detailed structure of the heavenly realm. He was taken on guided tours of different levels of heaven, shown the various classes of angels and their specific responsibilities, and given understanding of how the spiritual realm was organized to accomplish God's purposes. He wrote about the cherubim who surrounded God's throne, the seraphim who led heavenly worship, the archangels who carried out special divine missions, and countless other angelic beings who served in various capacities. This wasn't just abstract theology. These were detailed descriptions based on actual observation and interaction. Enoch also recorded extensive information about the cosmic order that governed all creation. He wrote about the paths of the sun and moon, the changing of the seasons, the movement of the stars, and the natural laws that kept the universe functioning in perfect harmony. But he explained all of these things from a spiritual perspective, showing how physical laws reflected spiritual principles. Perhaps most significantly, he was given prophetic visions that extended far beyond the immediate judgment of the flood. He saw kingdoms that would rise and fall throughout human history, witnessed the coming of the promised Redeemer, and observed the ultimate restoration when God's kingdom would be established on earth. These prophetic writings were particularly detailed when it came to the end times. Enoch saw visions of a final judgment when all evil would be permanently defeated, when the righteous would be rewarded and the wicked punished. when the earth itself would be renewed and made perfect once again. But he also wrote about the hope that lay beyond judgment, the eternal fellowship between God and his people that would be established after all evil was removed from creation. He described a new heaven and earth where righteousness would dwell, where there would be no more death or suffering, where humans would enjoy the kind of direct relationship with God that had been lost in the Garden of Eden. As Enoch's written work grew in length and scope, he began to understand that he was creating something completely unprecedented in human history. Never before had anyone attempted to record such comprehensive revelations about the spiritual realm, such detailed accounts of angelic activities, or such specific prophecies about future events. The book that was emerging from his divine inspiration was unlike anything that had ever existed. It provided a complete cosmology, a detailed explanation of how the universe was organized and how spiritual forces influenced earthly events. It answered questions that had puzzled humans since the beginning of creation and provided hope for those facing spiritual darkness. But with this privilege came enormous responsibility. Enoch understood that his writings would be preserved and studied by generations of people who would never have the kind of direct spiritual experiences he had been given. His words would need to be accurate, clear, and helpful for people facing very different circumstances than those of his own time. The angels emphasized to him that his book would serve multiple purposes throughout history. It would provide comfort to the faithful during times of persecution, understanding to seekers during times of spiritual confusion, and hope to the despairing during times of apparent divine silence. As he neared the completion of his writing assignment, Enoch was given one final revelation that would make his work even more significant. He was shown that his unique role as a divine scribe would not end with his earthly life. Something unprecedented was about to happen to him, something that would set him apart from every other human who had ever lived. The angels revealed that Enoch would not experience death as other humans did. Instead, he would be translated directly from earthly existence into the heavenly realm. His physical body would be transformed, and he would be taken up to dwell with God forever, continuing his work as a heavenly scribe throughout eternity. This promise of translation was both thrilling and sobering. It meant that Enoch's ministry would continue beyond his earthly life, but it also meant that he was being permanently separated from normal human existence. He would become a bridge between heaven and earth, serving both realms, but fully belonging to neither. As the time for his translation approached, Enoch put the finishing touches on his written revelations. He had created a comprehensive record of divine truth that would serve as a guide for seekers of spiritual understanding for thousands of years to come. But he had no way of knowing that these same writings would one day become so controversial that religious authorities would try to destroy every copy. The book that was meant to provide hope and understanding would become a source of fear and persecution for those who dared to read it. What happened next would make Enoch's story even more remarkable and controversial. Stay tuned as we discover how this ancient scribe became the first human to be translated to heaven, and why his writings would later terrify the church. Chapter 9. Walking Between Worlds. As Enoch completed his work as a divine scribe, something unprecedented began happening to him physically and spiritually. The intensive exposure to heavenly realms was transforming not just his understanding, but his very nature. He was becoming something new in human experience, a being who existed simultaneously in both earthly and heavenly dimensions. The Bible simply states that Enoch walked with God, but this phrase hardly captures the magnitude of what was actually occurring. Enoch was developing a relationship with the Creator that was more intimate and direct than any human had experienced since Adam and Eve walked with God in the Garden of Eden. Unlike the occasional visions that other prophets would later receive, Enoch's communication with the divine realm became constant and continuous. He could access heavenly knowledge and angelic guidance whenever he needed it. The boundary between earth and heaven became increasingly transparent for him. This transformation wasn't just spiritual, it was also physical. People who knew Enoch began to notice changes in his appearance and demeanor. There was a light about him that seemed to come from within, a presence that made others aware they were in the company of someone who had touched the divine realm. His wisdom in dealing with human affairs became supernatural. When people brought him disputes or problems, he would provide solutions that seemed to come from divine insight rather than human reasoning. His understanding of people's hearts and motivations went far beyond what natural observation could provide. But perhaps most remarkably, Enoch began to serve as a mediator between the heavenly and earthly realms in ways that no human had ever done before. Angels would bring him messages to deliver to humans, and humans would ask him to carry their prayers and concerns to the divine throne. This mediating role became particularly significant when the fallen watchers, desperate and facing divine judgment, approached Enoch with an unprecedented request. These rebellious angels, who had corrupted themselves and humanity, were looking for some way to communicate with God, but their sin had separated them from the divine presence. In their desperation, they came to Enoch, hoping that he could intercede for them. They asked him to write a petition on their behalf, pleading for forgiveness and restoration. They acknowledged their guilt in corrupting humanity and bringing judgment upon the earth, but they hoped that God might show them mercy if their request came through someone who still had access to the divine presence. This request put Enoch in an incredibly difficult position. These were the beings whose rebellion had caused immense suffering on earth, whose forbidden teachings had corrupted entire civilizations, whose offspring had terrorized innocent humans. Yet they were also creatures who had once served God faithfully, beings who were now facing eternal punishment for their choices. After much prayer and seeking divine guidance, Enoch agreed to carry their petition to God. This wasn't because he approved of what they had done, but because he understood the importance of mercy and the possibility of redemption, even for those who had committed terrible sins. During one of his heavenly journeys, Enoch presented the fallen watcher's petition to the divine throne, The response he received was both just and final. God acknowledged the Watchers' guilt and confirmed that the consequences of their rebellion could not be undone. The corruption they had brought to earth was too great to be overlooked, and the judgment they faced was deserved. However, God also revealed his greater plan for redemption, not for the fallen Watchers themselves, but for the humanity they had helped to corrupt. The coming flood would wash away the immediate consequences of their rebellion, and God's long-term plan would ultimately provide a way for humans to be restored to right relationship with their Creator. This experience taught Enoch profound lessons about both divine justice and divine mercy. He learned that while God's forgiveness was always available to those who truly repented, some consequences could not be undone. The fallen Watchers would face their judgment, but humanity would ultimately be offered a path to restoration. As Enoch continued in his role as mediator, his reputation spread far beyond his own city. People would travel great distances just to meet with him and receive his counsel. They brought him their deepest questions about God, about righteousness, about the meaning of life and death. But Enoch always pointed them back to the fundamental truth he had learned through his heavenly journeys, that God desired relationship with humanity, and that this relationship was possible through faith and obedience. He helped people understand that the corruption they saw in the world around them was not permanent, that divine judgment was coming to cleanse the earth, and that hope lay in maintaining faithfulness to the true God despite the darkness surrounding them. During this period, Enoch's family life also continued. He married and had children, including a son named Methuselah, who would become famous for his extraordinarily long life. But even his role as husband and father was transformed by his spiritual calling. Enoch's children grew up in a household where angelic visitations were normal, where divine revelations were regular occurrences, where the boundary between earth and heaven was constantly being crossed. They learned from birth that there was more to existence than what could be seen with physical eyes. This gave them a unique perspective on the corruption that was spreading throughout the world. While other children were being influenced by the forbidden knowledge and violent culture around them, Enoch's family maintained their connection to divine truth and spiritual reality. Methuselah, in particular, inherited his father's spiritual sensitivity and became a bridge between Enoch's generation and the generation that would survive the flood. Through him, the knowledge and revelations that Enoch had received would be preserved and passed down to Noah and his family. As the time approached for the divine judgment that Enoch had seen in his visions, his role as a bridge between worlds became even more crucial. He served as a warning voice to his generation, explaining what was coming and why it was necessary, while also providing hope for those who remained faithful to God. But not everyone welcomed Enoch's messages. Many people found his warnings about coming judgment disturbing and unwelcome. They preferred to focus on their immediate pleasures and achievements rather than face the reality of divine accountability. Some actively opposed Enoch's ministry, seeing him as a threat to the corrupt systems they had built. The giants and their human servants particularly resented his influence because his teachings undermined their authority and exposed the spiritual deception underlying their power. Yet Enoch continued his work faithfully, knowing that his primary accountability was to God rather than to human approval. He understood that his calling was to speak divine truth regardless of how it was received, to serve as a faithful witness to heavenly realities even in the midst of earthly corruption. As his earthly ministry continued, the angels began preparing Enoch for the unprecedented event that would conclude his time on earth. They explained that his unique role as a bridge between heaven and earth would continue beyond his physical life, but in a completely transformed way. The translation that awaited Enoch would be unlike anything that had ever happened to a human being. He would not experience death as others did, but would be taken directly from earthly existence into the heavenly realm, where he would continue serving as a scribe and mediator throughout eternity. This promise both thrilled and sobered Enoch. It meant that his service to God would continue forever, but it also meant permanent separation from normal human existence. He would become something new in creation, a human being who had been fully integrated into the heavenly realm while retaining his essential humanity. As the day of his translation approached, Enoch completed the final portions of his written revelations. He had created a comprehensive record of divine truth that would serve generations of seekers long after his departure from earth. But he could never have imagined that these same writings would one day become so controversial that religious authorities would try to destroy every copy, or that his book would be banned by the very people who claimed to serve the God he had walked with so intimately. What happened to Enoch next would make him one of the most mysterious and controversial figures in all of spiritual history. Keep watching as we discover the incredible conclusion of his earthly journey and the beginning of his eternal ministry. Chapter 10. The Banned Revelation. The book that Enoch wrote during his extraordinary spiritual journey became something completely unprecedented in human history. Never before had anyone attempted to record such detailed visions of the heavenly realm, such comprehensive revelations about angels and cosmic mysteries, or such specific prophecies about divine judgment and restoration. What Enoch created was the world's first piece of apocalyptic literature, a type of writing that would influence religious thought for thousands of years to come. His work provided answers to questions that had puzzled humanity since creation began, offering insights into the spiritual realm that no human had ever possessed before. The book was massive and comprehensive, containing not just Enoch's personal experiences, but detailed explanations of how the spiritual and physical realms interacted. He wrote about the different classes of angels and their specific roles in God's creation. He documented the rebellion of the Watchers and how their forbidden knowledge had corrupted humanity. He described the coming judgment and the hope of future redemption. But what made Enoch's book truly revolutionary was its scope and detail. Previous religious writings had been much simpler, stories about God's interactions with individuals, basic laws for living, simple songs of worship. But Enoch's book was different. It provided a complete cosmology, a detailed explanation of how the universe was organized and how spiritual forces influenced earthly events. The content was both fascinating and disturbing. Enoch wrote extensively about the fallen angels, naming specific watchers and describing exactly what forbidden knowledge each one had shared with humanity. He provided detailed accounts of the Nephilim, their enormous size, their supernatural abilities, and their systematic oppression of ordinary humans. Perhaps most shocking were his vivid descriptions of divine judgment. Enoch had seen the coming flood in incredible detail and wrote about it with prophetic certainty. He described not just the physical catastrophe, but its spiritual significance as God's response to the corruption that had infected his creation. The book also contained extensive prophecies about the end times that stretched far beyond the immediate judgment of the flood. Enoch wrote about kingdoms that would rise and fall, about the coming of a promised Redeemer, and about ultimate restoration when righteousness would reign on earth. As Enoch's book began to circulate among the people of his time, it created an immediate sensation. Nothing like this had ever been written before. People were amazed by the detailed descriptions of heavenly realms, fascinated by the explanations of angelic hierarchies, and sobered by the warnings of coming judgment. The book answered questions that had puzzled humans since creation began. The brief mention in Genesis about the sons of God taking the daughters of men was expanded into a comprehensive account of angelic rebellion. The mysterious reference to giants in the earth was explained through detailed descriptions of the Nephilim and their oppression of humanity. Early Jewish communities embraced Enoch's writings with enthusiasm. Here was a book that provided detailed explanations for things they had only heard hints about in other writings. Jewish scholars and teachers began studying Enoch's book carefully, finding in it explanations for many puzzling aspects of their faith. The Book of Enoch was particularly valued during times of persecution and difficulty, when Jewish communities faced oppression from foreign rulers or struggled with questions about why the righteous suffered while the wicked prospered. Enoch's book provided answers. It showed that there was a spiritual dimension to earthly conflicts, that God was aware of human suffering, and that ultimate justice would prevail. For several centuries, the Book of Enoch held a place of honor in Jewish religious literature. It was quoted by teachers, referenced by scholars, and treasured by ordinary believers. While it was never formally included in the Hebrew Scriptures, it was widely regarded as a valuable and authentic revelation from God. When Christianity began to emerge from its Jewish roots, the early believers naturally inherited the Jewish respect for Enoch's book. The New Testament writers were clearly familiar with its contents, and several of them made direct or indirect references to its teachings. The clearest New Testament reference to Enoch's book appears in the letter of Jude, which quotes directly from Enoch's prophecies. "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him." This passage treats Enoch's book as authentic prophecy, worthy of quotation in New Testament scripture. Other New Testament writings also show familiarity with Enochic themes: the detailed angelology in Paul's letters, the cosmic conflict themes in Revelation, and even Jesus' references to himself as the Son of Man, all reflect concepts that were developed comprehensively in Enoch's writings. Early Christian teachers and writers continued this pattern of respect for Enoch's book. Church fathers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Clement of Alexandria all treated it as valuable religious literature. They quoted from it in their teachings, referenced its explanations of spiritual mysteries, and recommended it to their followers. The Book of Enoch was particularly valued by early Christians who were trying to understand the cosmic dimensions of their faith. It helped explain why there was a spiritual battle between good and evil, how Christ's victory related to angelic conflicts, and what the ultimate future held for both humanity and the spiritual realm. For the first few centuries of Christianity, Enoch's book enjoyed widespread acceptance and respect. It was copied in multiple languages, studied by scholars, and quoted by teachers. Many Christians considered it an essential text for understanding the full scope of God's plan for creation. However, as Christianity became more organized and institutionalized, questions began to arise about which books should be considered authoritative. Scripture. Church leaders started developing formal criteria for determining which writings belonged in the biblical canon and which should be considered secondary literature. The first concerns about Enoch's book were not about its content, but about its authorship. Some church leaders began to question whether the book had really been written by the biblical Enoch who had been translated to heaven. They pointed out that the book contained detailed prophecies about events that had occurred long after Enoch's time, suggesting that it might have been written much later by someone else. These authorship questions led to broader concerns about the book's authority. If Enoch had not actually written the book that bore his name, then on what basis should it be considered divinely inspired scripture? Church leaders began to distinguish between books that were clearly written by biblical figures and those that might be later compositions attributed to ancient heroes. Another concern that arose was about some of the specific content in Enoch's book. While the overall themes of angelic rebellion and divine judgment were accepted, some church leaders became uncomfortable with certain details. The graphic descriptions of angelic human unions, the extensive focus on forbidden knowledge, and the detailed angelology seemed to some leaders to be unnecessarily speculative or potentially misleading. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and encountered Greek philosophical traditions, some church leaders began to prefer more philosophical and less mythological approaches to theology. The vivid narrative style of Enoch's book, with its detailed descriptions of heavenly journeys and angelic encounters, seemed to some to be too primitive or unsophisticated for educated Christian audiences. The gradual shift in attitude toward Enoch's book was not sudden or dramatic. different church leaders held different opinions, and the book continued to be valued in some Christian communities, even as it fell out of favor in others. However, the trend was clearly toward viewing it as interesting but not authoritative, valuable but not canonical. The formal rejection of Enoch's book by the mainstream church came gradually through a series of church councils and authoritative pronouncements. Church fathers like Jerome and Augustine, who were highly influential in shaping Christian doctrine, expressed reservations about including Enoch's book in the biblical canon. By the 5th century, Enoch's book had been relegated to the status of apocryphal literature in most Christian communities. The official exclusion was accompanied by active efforts to suppress its circulation. Church authorities instructed that copies should not be made or distributed, and existing copies were often destroyed. The reasons behind the church's decision to suppress Enoch's writings were complex and varied. Officially, church leaders cited concerns about authorship, questions about canonical authority, and worries about theological confusion. But there may have been other motivations as well. Enoch's book contained detailed criticisms of corrupt religious leaders and warnings about institutional religious corruption. Some scholars suggest that church leaders may have been uncomfortable with these prophetic challenges to religious authority. The book's emphasis on direct divine revelation outside of institutional channels may have seemed threatening to leaders who were trying to establish clerical authority. The suppression of Enoch's book was largely successful throughout most of the Christian world. For over 1,000 years, the book virtually disappeared from Christian communities in Europe and the Mediterranean. Most Christians forgot that such a book had ever existed. However, the story of Enoch's book did not end with its suppression by the mainstream church. In one corner of the Christian world, the book continued to be treasured and preserved, setting the stage for one of the most remarkable stories of textual survival in religious history. Don't miss what happens next, because the survival of Enoch's book is as miraculous as its original composition. Hit that subscribe button and keep watching to discover how a banned book survived against impossible odds. Chapter 11. Church Against Truth. The campaign to suppress Enoch's book was not merely a matter of theological disagreement or scholarly debate. It represented a systematic effort by religious authorities to control what ordinary Christians could read, think, and believe about the spiritual realm. What began as questions about canonical authority soon became an active program of censorship and persecution. Church leaders who had once quoted Enoch's writings began to speak against them publicly. They argued that the book contained dangerous speculations that could mislead simple believers. They claimed that its vivid descriptions of angelic encounters and heavenly realms encouraged unhealthy spiritual imagination rather than practical Christian living. But there were deeper issues at stake beyond theological concerns. Enoch's book presented a vision of divine revelation that bypassed institutional religious authority. It showed that God could communicate directly with individuals, giving them insights and understanding that surpassed what religious leaders possessed. This threatened the growing power structure of organized Christianity. The book's detailed criticisms of corrupt religious leaders also made it dangerous to church authorities who were consolidating their power. Enoch had written about shepherds who fed themselves rather than their flocks, about religious leaders who cared more about wealth and status than about serving God's people. These ancient warnings seemed uncomfortably relevant to the political situations facing the organized church. As the church became more integrated with Roman political power, leaders became increasingly concerned about maintaining social stability and avoiding controversial teachings. Enoch's book, with its detailed descriptions of divine judgment and cosmic conflict, seemed too radical and potentially disruptive for a church that was trying to find its place within established political structures. The suppression efforts began with subtle discouragements. Church leaders would warn against reading uncertain or doubtful books that were not part of the established biblical canon. They would emphasize the importance of focusing on clearly authoritative scriptures rather than exploring speculative literature. But as resistance to these warnings continued, because many Christians found Enoch's book spiritually valuable, the efforts became more direct and forceful. Church councils began issuing formal lists of canonical books that specifically excluded Enoch's writings. Anyone who continued to copy, distribute, or teach from the book was subject to church discipline. The Council of Laodicea in 364 AD was one of the first to issue an official list of canonical books that excluded Enoch's writings. This set a precedent that other regional councils would follow, gradually creating a consensus that Enoch's book was not suitable for Christian reading. But exclusion from the canon was not enough to satisfy some church leaders. They began actively seeking out copies of Enoch's book and ordering them destroyed. Scribes were forbidden to copy it, teachers were prohibited from quoting it, and ordinary Christians were warned that reading it could endanger their souls. The destruction campaign was remarkably successful in most parts of the Christian world. Ancient libraries that had preserved copies for centuries suddenly found their Enochic manuscripts disappearing. Monasteries that had maintained scriptoriums stopped including Enoch's book in their copying programs. Private collectors became afraid to admit they owned copies. This systematic suppression was justified through increasingly harsh rhetoric about the dangers of heretical literature. Church leaders began portraying Enoch's book not just as questionable or speculative, but as actively dangerous to Christian faith. They claimed it contained demonic deceptions designed to lead believers away from true doctrine. The irony of this campaign was profound. The very book that had provided the foundation for much early Christian understanding of angels, demons, and cosmic conflict was now being portrayed as the work of demons. The writings that had helped explain the spiritual dimensions of Christ's victory were now being condemned as spiritual deception. Some courageous Christian teachers tried to resist the suppression, arguing that Enoch's book had been valued by apostolic communities and quoted in the New Testament itself. They pointed out that the book's warnings about corrupt religious leaders were proving remarkably accurate in their own time. But these voices of resistance were overwhelmed by the institutional pressure to conform. Teachers who continued to reference Enoch's writings found themselves marginalized or excluded from Christian fellowship. Scholars who tried to preserve copies for historical study were accused of promoting heresy. The suppression campaign was particularly effective because it coincided with broader changes in how Christianity understood authority and revelation. The early Christian movement had been characterized by diverse communities with different collections of revered texts and different approaches to spiritual experience. But as the church became more centralized and institutionalized, there was increasing pressure to standardize beliefs and practices. The diversity that had once been seen as evidence of the Spirit's work in different communities began to be viewed as dangerous division that threatened Christian unity. Enoch's book became a casualty of this drive towards standardization. Its unique perspective on spiritual reality, which had once enriched Christian understanding, was now seen as a deviation from approved doctrine. Its detailed revelations about the cosmic dimensions of faith were dismissed as unnecessary speculation. The political dimensions of the suppression cannot be ignored. As Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, church leaders became increasingly concerned about maintaining social order and avoiding teachings that might seem revolutionary or threatening to established authority. Enoch's book, with its detailed descriptions of corrupt rulers being judged by God and its promises of divine intervention to establish justice, could easily be interpreted as politically subversive. Church leaders who were trying to maintain good relationships with Roman authorities found such themes embarrassing and dangerous. The campaign against Enoch's book was also part of a broader effort to distinguish Christianity from Jewish traditions. As the church sought to establish itself as a distinct religion rather than a Jewish sect, leaders began distancing themselves from literature that was particularly treasured by Jewish communities. Since Enoch's book had remained popular in Jewish circles, even as some Christian communities began rejecting it, suppressing the book became a way of signaling that Christianity had its own distinct scriptural authority, separate from Jewish traditions. By the end of the 5th century, the suppression campaign had achieved remarkable success throughout most of the Christian world. Copies of Enoch's book had become extremely rare in Christian communities, from Western Europe to the Byzantine Empire. Most Christians had no idea that such a book had ever existed. The few remaining copies were hidden away in private collections or preserved in remote monasteries where they were rarely consulted. The book that had once been widely quoted by Christian teachers became a forgotten relic of an earlier era. Church historians began rewriting the story of early Christianity to minimize the influence that Enoch's book had once possessed. The direct quotations in Jude and the thematic influences throughout the New Testament were either ignored or explained away as references to oral traditions rather than to a specific written text. This historical revisionism was so successful that for centuries, most Christians believed that the few fragmentary references to Enochic traditions represented folklore or legend rather than preserved literature. The comprehensive book that had shaped early Christian understanding of spiritual reality was effectively erased from Christian memory. But the suppression campaign, successful as it was in most of the Christian world, had failed to account for one crucial factor: In the remote highlands of Ethiopia, there existed a Christian community that had never accepted the decision to reject Enoch's book. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church continued to regard it as canonical scripture long after it had been banned elsewhere. This meant that while church authorities in Rome, Constantinople, and other major Christian centers congratulated themselves on successfully suppressing a dangerous text, complete copies were being carefully preserved in Ethiopian monasteries. Scribes were continuing to copy it, teachers were continuing to quote it, and ordinary believers were continuing to read it as part of their biblical canon. The Ethiopian preservation of Enoch's book would prove to be one of the most significant acts of cultural and religious resistance in history. Without their faithfulness to this ancient text, the modern world would never have had the opportunity to rediscover the remarkable revelations that had once shaped early Christian thought. But for over 1,000 years, the suppression appeared to be complete. The book that had been banned by the church seemed to have vanished forever, taking with it the detailed revelations about spiritual reality that had once provided hope and understanding to countless believers. What happened next would vindicate the Ethiopian Church's faithfulness and provide one of the most dramatic stories of textual rediscovery in modern history. Keep watching to discover how a banned book survived against impossible odds and returned to shake the modern world. Chapter 12: The Hidden Survival. While church authorities across Europe and the Mediterranean world congratulated themselves on successfully suppressing Enoch's dangerous book, something remarkable was happening in the remote highlands of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had never accepted the decision to ban Enoch's writings, and they continued to preserve and study the text as canonical scripture. The Ethiopian Christians had received the Book of Enoch through early Christian missionaries who had brought it to their region before the suppression campaigns began. When they translated it into their local language, gaye, they treated it as authentic scripture worthy of the same reverence given to other biblical books. As news of the book's rejection by other Christian communities reached Ethiopia, the church leaders there faced a difficult decision. Should they follow the example of the broader Christian world and abandon this text? Or should they trust their own spiritual discernment and continue preserving what they believed to be genuine divine revelation? The Ethiopian church chose preservation over conformity. They maintained that the Book of Enoch was authentic scripture that deserved to be maintained and studied, regardless of what other churches decided. This decision would prove to be one of the most significant acts of cultural and religious preservation in history. For over a millennium, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was virtually the only Christian community that preserved complete copies of Enoch's book. While fragments and references survived in other places, the Ethiopians maintained the full text in their religious libraries and monasteries. Ethiopian monks continued copying the text by hand, ensuring that multiple copies existed in different locations. They treated this work as a sacred duty, understanding that they were preserving divine revelation that might otherwise be lost forever. Each new copy was made with the same care and reverence given to copying other biblical books. The book remained part of Ethiopian Christian worship and education. Passages from Enoch were read in liturgical services, quoted in sermons, and taught to new generations of believers. The Ethiopian Church's biblical canon officially included Enoch alongside the books that other Christians accepted as scripture. This preservation effort required remarkable courage and commitment. The Ethiopian Church knew that their decision to maintain Enoch's book set them apart from most of the Christian world. They faced criticism and suspicion from other Christian communities who viewed their biblical canon as dangerously expanded. But Ethiopian church leaders remained convinced that they were preserving authentic, divine revelation. They pointed out that the book had been quoted in the New Testament, valued by early Christian communities, and helpful for understanding spiritual realities. They refused to abandon it simply because it had become controversial elsewhere. The isolation of Ethiopia from the major centers of Christian power actually worked in favor of preserving Enoch's book. While European and Mediterranean churches were under pressure to conform to standardized doctrines and practices, the Ethiopian church developed more independently. This independence allowed them to maintain traditions and texts that were being suppressed elsewhere. They preserved not only the Book of Enoch, but also other ancient Christian writings that were disappearing from libraries in other parts of the world. The Ethiopian preservation effort was not merely passive maintenance of ancient manuscripts. Ethiopian scholars continued studying Enoch's book, writing commentaries on its contents, and finding in it insights that enriched their understanding of Christian faith. They particularly appreciated the book's detailed explanations of spiritual warfare, its comprehensive angelology, and its hopeful prophecies about divine justice. These themes resonated with Ethiopian Christians, who often faced political persecution and needed encouragement about God's ultimate control over earthly affairs. The modern rediscovery of Enoch's book began in the 18th century when European travelers to Ethiopia encountered the text in Ethiopian monasteries. James Bruce, a Scottish explorer, obtained copies of the book during his travels in Ethiopia in the 1770s and brought them back to Europe. When Bruce returned with these manuscripts, European scholars were amazed by what they found. Here was the source of numerous quotations and references they had found in early Christian literature, but had never been able to trace. The book provided the missing link for understanding many aspects of early Jewish and Christian thought that had previously been mysterious. The initial reaction of European scholars was skepticism mixed with excitement. They were thrilled to discover this long-lost text, but they questioned whether the Ethiopian manuscripts represented the original ancient book or later compositions that had been attributed to Enoch. However, as scholars began studying the Ethiopian manuscripts more carefully, they found clear evidence that these were indeed translations of ancient texts. The language, style, and content all pointed to origins in the centuries before Christ, exactly as the Ethiopian Church had maintained. The discovery of additional manuscripts in the 20th century particularly among the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirmed that the Ethiopian Church had indeed preserved an authentic ancient text. Fragments of Enoch's book found at Qumran showed that the book had been known and valued by Jewish communities around the time of Christ. This archaeological confirmation vindicated the Ethiopian Church's centuries-long preservation effort. They had been right to trust their spiritual discernment and maintain this text despite criticism from other Christian communities. Their faithfulness had made possible the modern rediscovery of one of the most important pieces of ancient religious literature. The modern availability of Enoch's book has opened up entirely new areas of biblical and historical scholarship. Researchers have been able to trace the development of Jewish and Christian thought in ways that were previously impossible. The book provides crucial background for understanding how ideas about angels, demons, the afterlife, and cosmic conflict developed in ancient, religious communities. Scholars have also been able to appreciate the literary sophistication of Enoch's book in ways that earlier generations could not. The complex narrative structure, the detailed cosmological descriptions, and the intricate prophecies show a level of literary craftsmanship that was far ahead of its time. The influence of Enoch's book on later religious literature has become increasingly clear as scholars have studied its contents. Many themes and images that appear in later Jewish and Christian writings can be traced back to ideas that were first developed comprehensively in Enoch's book. The recovery of Enoch's book has also shed new light on the diversity of early Christianity. It has become clear that the early Christian movement was much more varied in its beliefs and practices than later church traditions suggested. Different Christian communities had different collections of authoritative books, different theological emphases, and different approaches to understanding their faith. The suppression of Enoch's book was part of a broader process by which one particular version of Christianity became dominant while others were marginalized. The story illustrates how human institutions, with their political pressures and cultural biases, play a role in determining which religious texts are preserved and which are forgotten. The Ethiopian Church's preservation of Enoch's book has also highlighted the important role that marginalized religious communities sometimes play in preserving ancient traditions. While the mainstream Christian Church was suppressing the book, the Ethiopian Christians continued to value it as sacred scripture. Their faithfulness to this ancient text made possible its modern rediscovery and the scholarly insights that have followed. Without their centuries-long preservation effort, the modern world would never have had the opportunity to study this remarkable piece of ancient literature. Today, the Book of Enoch is widely available and studied by scholars around the world. While most Christian churches still do not regard it as canonical scripture, it is recognized as an important historical document that provides valuable insights into early Jewish and Christian thought. The story of its suppression and preservation serves as a powerful reminder of how religious texts navigate through history. Political pressures, institutional decisions, cultural changes, and individual choices all play roles in determining which ancient writings survive and which are forgotten. The fact that this particular book managed to survive complete suppression speaks to both the dedication of those who preserved it and the intrinsic power of its contents to continue attracting readers across centuries and cultures. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's courageous decision to maintain this text, despite widespread opposition, ultimately benefited not just their own community, but the entire world's understanding of ancient religious thought. The banned Book of Enoch had survived against impossible odds, preserved by a faithful community that refused to abandon what they believed to be divine truth. Its modern rediscovery has opened new windows into the spiritual world that shaped early Christianity and continues to influence religious understanding today. If this incredible story of forbidden knowledge, ancient mysteries, and miraculous survival has fascinated you, make sure you're subscribed for more hidden biblical histories. Share this video with anyone who loves discovering the truth behind the stories we thought we knew. What surprised you most about Enoch's incredible journey from the son of a murderer to heaven's chosen scribe? What do you think about the church's decision to ban his revelations? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your thoughts on these amazing biblical mysteries. Thanks for joining me on this journey through forbidden history. Until next time, keep seeking the truth that others tried to hide.